Hi guys, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about what is required to return to running post ACL, what criteria you need to achieve in order to achieve a return to running successfully. First of all, the reason why it's so important is that without having criteria, you don't have a clear set of targets to aim for. So you've got to make sure you've got clear targets that you're working towards. It gives you confidence then that your body's ready to return to running as well. Taking a step back, running places a lot of stress, a lot of force on the body, and running can place sort of three times a body weight force through your body on any given step. High speed sprinting, when you build up to that, can be anywhere as much as seven times body weight. So, some of the highest amount of load that your body is ever going to experience. So, we've got to make sure our bodies are robust and resilient enough to be prepared for that. So, we're not going into it blindly, we're not going into it with any kind of guesswork involved. You want to make sure you've got really clear criteria. And there's going to be a set of criteria across different physical qualities that we've also got to make sure are in place in order to make sure we are fully ready for that. So we know that there's a lot of force required to run. We know that's going to place a lot of demand on the body. And if we haven't introduced any running yet after ACL tear, surgery, and then early stage rehab, we've got to make sure we've got these criteria in place. So the criteria are going to cover off sort of three distinct areas. The first is movement quality, the second is capacity, and the third one is force. So let's look at movement quality first of all. If you're not able to complete movements effectively, it doesn't really matter how much load you can move in that exercise. So if we take something like a back squat, for example, being able to load a back squat at a certain amount. Well, if that exercise isn't being executed effectively because there's still asymmetry in how the body is moving, well, it doesn't really matter if we can lift that amount of load because there's going to be a degree of asymmetry that exists still. Now, in this kind of second stage of rehab, as we introduce running, there doesn't have to be no asymmetry. Generally, a general rule of thumb is under 15%, ideally 10% asymmetry. So there's going to be a degree of that. But if we're not moving effectively in our basic movement patterns, then that's always going to place risk on the body. So the first and foremost thing we've got to get right is that can the athlete move effectively? Can they land effectively? Can they move effectively in lunge patterns, in hop patterns, in squat based patterns? So that when it comes to running, which is essentially a combination of those different movement patterns, that the body is actually ready for that. So if we take a landing based movement first of all, can the athlete do a drop landing from a small box without loss of movement control, without the inclusion of things like lateral trunk lean, which can be a factor in ACL re-injury risk, without knee valgus, without ankle collapse? Can they do that effectively? Can they do the same thing on a single leg drop landing without any loss of movement and control? And again, the reason why is because it's so relevant to what running is. You are essentially landing on a single leg over and over again. And if we can't do that at a basic level off of a box, then it doesn't really matter how well we can do that at a higher speed. We've got to make sure we can do it at slow speed and a low intensity to begin with, and then build up after that. So, can we perform a hop on a single leg, a drop landing on a single leg, a drop landing on two legs? Can we perform a single leg squat for 10 repetitions on each leg with really good control without any loss of movement, without any kind of significant asymmetry there? Again, around 15% asymmetry would mean that for a 10 rep target, we'd be sitting at around 10 to 12 reps on both limbs without, a significant asymmetry. So it's not just good enough to have 10 reps on the injured side and 25 on the non-injured side, because that would be a far too big asymmetry. It needs to be above 10 reps and within 15% of that affected leg. Now, again, the problem with asymmetry only is that it may be that the uninjured leg is actually reduced in performance capability because the body's neuromuscular system is slightly dimmed down. Like if you imagine like a dimmer switch, what happens after an ACL tear is that the body slightly reduces the output of our neuromuscular system to protect itself, which is helpful in some ways, but it also is a hindrance in other ways. So if we're only using asymmetry as a measure, it's actually quite difficult to compare that and only use asymmetry as a measure. We've got to have absolute targets, so rep-based targets, and the asymmetry to compare that with as well. Otherwise, we might be missing some key information there. So something like a single leg squat, at least 10 repetitions, and no more than a 15% asymmetry. So, for example, 10 reps, and then 11 reps or 12 reps on the other leg would be acceptable. But really, we've got to take into consideration other factors here, not just a single target to aim for. We've also got to think about how well that exercise is being executed, and also things like body weight. If you've got someone who's a fairly light athlete, well, doing 10 repetitions at body weight is actually going to be pretty easy. If you've got a heavier athlete, someone who's, let's say, a forward in rugby or contact-based athlete with a higher body mass, then that relatively is going to be a slightly more difficult challenge for them. So we've got to also take that into consideration. But that's a good target to aim for. At least 10 really well controlled single leg squats to a box at 90-degree knee angle on both legs, at least with less than 15% asymmetry. We've also got some balance and asymmetry considerations. So things like a single leg balance on one leg, both with eyes open and with eyes closed. Again, can you achieve that without a significant asymmetry of more than 10 to 15%? Usually, the kind of cutoff for the target for an eyes open single leg balance should be around 45 to 60 seconds and 10 to 15 seconds with eyes closed. If you can do both of those two effectively, that's going to also put you in a much more effective position to be able to control the ankle and knee positions in space. So, not only do we need movement control, we also need that proprioceptive capability as well, that we can control our limbs and not have this significant asymmetry again in how coordinated our limbs are and how well we can coordinate and allow our body to maintain balance essentially in space. Now we've looked at single leg squatting, we've looked at double leg landing, single leg landing, we've looked at your balance, that being really, really key. Other ones then are key muscle groups capacity, and capacity is essentially the local muscular endurance of the muscle group. So how much volume can it tolerate essentially. 20 reps of a single leg bridge and a single leg calf raise is a really good target to aim for here. But really, you can increase that target. The standard should probably be 25 to 30 if we're thinking about trying to get someone back to running. So I would probably elevate that standard from 20 to at least 25, ideally 30 reps of a single leg bridge and 30 reps of a single leg calf raise. Because what that's going to do is it's going to give you indication that the muscle groups themselves are capable of extending the hip and plantar flexing the ankle at volume without reductions in technique, without reductions in sort of force capability, without breakdowns in the effectiveness of that movement. We've got to make sure that we can do those simultaneous reps. Because again, if we're looking to build running volume once we've introduced it, well, there's going to be a lot of volume incorporated there. If we can only do 10 reps of a single leg calf raise, well, the body simply isn't ready enough for that volume of running just yet. So that's another key one, is making sure we've got the hamstring and calf capability to make sure we can withstand and tolerate those loads consecutively over consecutive repetitions. Again, less than 15% asymmetry. So for a 20 rep target, then we shouldn't have a deficit or a difference of more than sort of 2 to 3 reps, ideally. So if someone can do a single leg calf raise of 20 reps on their injured side, but they can do 30 reps on the non-injured side, then that would be too much of an asymmetry at this stage. We want to bring that injured side up to standard, up to that 30 rep target. So baseline of 20, but no more than 15% asymmetry. Ideally 30 reps on both limbs with no more than 15% asymmetry on both bridge and calf raise will set you up well for introduction of basic linear running. Next component then is the lateral trunk capacity. Now, lateral trunk capacity is important because one of the risk factors for ACL injury is lateral trunk movement or displacement. And that's because when you get into this kind of leaning position, so lateral trunk lean in combination with knee valgus, where the knee is collapsing inward, that's where you get a lot of rotational torque around the knee. So if we can reduce the amount of lateral trunk lean through good trunk control, motor control through the trunk, and capacity, it's going to help to reduce that risk. So we can use a really simple test like a side plank here, and an athlete should be able to do at the very minimum 30 seconds on each side with no more than a 15-second asymmetry. But again, we could probably increase the standard there to pushing 60 seconds on each side, just to be really, really confident that the athlete is ready to go back to running without any significant deficit in lateral trunk capacity. Finally, then we're looking at force. So we've looked at so far landing mechanics and control, proprioception, capacity, trunk control. The last one is force capability. One of the most important ones of all is how much force can the body produce. And the reason why that's so important, as we've already said, is running is going to give a high amount of force, or it's going to require a high amount of force when we're completing running. A basic target here is 1.5 times body weight in a back squat and a single leg press. And for the back squat, if you are a 60 kilo athlete, that's obviously a 90 kilo 1RM target. And if you're a 80 kilo athlete, that's a 120 kilo 1RM target. But it doesn't mean you have to do a 1RM test. We can use sub-max loads to predict this. And we can use a very simple calculator, which I'll link down below, which is essentially the number of reps multiplied by the load, multiplied by 0.033, plus the load at that repetition range we've used, will give you a approximate estimate of your 1RM. So an example of this would be if you know you can do 80. I'm actually going to pull it up on my screen here, so I've got it. If we could do, say, 8 repetitions at 75 kilos, when our predicted 1RM would be 95 kilos. And if you're a 63 kilo athlete, that would be 1.5 times body weight. So you could use an 8 rep target there at 75 kilos to give you that 1.5 times body weight target to aim for. So hopefully that gives you a sort of an idea of the type of loads that you should be looking to achieve there. Finally, then we've mentioned that single leg press, and again, 1.5 times body weight is also the target here, with the inclusion, obviously, of the asymmetry of less than 15%. So if you could do a 100 kilo leg press on a single leg, but you could do 120 on the other leg, then obviously that would be greater than 15% asymmetry, and that would be a risk factor. Now, the reason why you want 1.5 times body weight, again, is because as we build up to the body having to tolerate these high amounts of loads, it's important that we can move that amount of load through full range of motion. Now, you might have noticed that's not 3 times body weight, but that's okay because the range of motion at the ankle during running is not full range of motion like a single leg press or a back squat. We're only really moving through a relatively short range of motion, which is why we can tolerate the amount of force that we can. We're not asking someone to do 3 times body weight back squat, which would obviously be elite level strength, because we're not needing to produce that amount of force through that degree of range. When it comes to doing running, obviously it's a much shorter range of motion at the ankle and lower body that we're actually asking the body to produce force at that level for, which is why we don't need to have this, huge strength target, and why our body is strong enough if we can do 1.5 times body weight for the demands of running. So in summary, we need something like movement control, single leg landing, double leg landing, movement control in a single leg squat to make sure our limbs are well aligned. We've got good trunk control, good hip control, good knee control for at least 10 repetitions with less than 15% asymmetry. Single leg balance on both sides, both eyes open and eyes closed. Capacity of the hamstring and calf through a bridge and a calf raise. Lateral trunk capacity through a side plank, try and aim for 30 seconds. And finally, force capability, 1.5 times body weight in a back squat and a single leg press. Now, if you can achieve all of those things, it's going to give real confidence that the athlete is ready to return to running, because we know they've got the movement control, the proprioceptive capability, the capacity, the trunk control, and the lower limb strength capability to tolerate the demands of running. So if you can tick off all of those different boxes, then you're in a really strong position to go back. And obviously, when you do go back, it's important not just to return to a full tilt running program. It needs to be gradually introduced through linear running to begin with at slow speeds, building intensity in linear running. So in other words, trying to increase the speed at which we're able to run. And once we're able to run at full speed in a linear direction, we can then begin to add volume of running through things like mass intervals, tempo intervals, things like that. And then finally, in phase 4, we're looking to actually return an athlete to sport. That's where we can introduce highly sport-specific movement, repeat sprintability, reactive change of direction drills, all that type of thing. But initially, linear, slow speed, gradually increase the speed. And then once we've achieved good levels of speed, we can begin to increase the volume of running and then introduce multi-directional running when appropriate to do so. So I hope that's been a useful introduction and a good overview of the demands that are required to get someone back to running post ACL.